What if I told you that nearly half of everything you do today isn't actually a choice?
It's a pretty wild thought,
Yeah.
honestly.
I want you to really just sit with that for a second. Think about all the things you consider to be, you making deliberate decisions today. And it turns out nearly half of it just isn't.
Yeah, it's a completely destabilizing thought when you first encounter it, because we all walk around with this really profound sense of agency.
Oh, totally.
We feel like we're the conscious captains of our own ships, navigating our days with intention and deliberate strategy.
But the data paints a radically different picture. And that's what we're getting into today. We are doing a deep dive into some incredible research, specifically looking at the work of Wendy Wood from the University of Southern California.
Right, she's a research psychologist who ran these massive observational studies.
Yeah, and what she found was that approximately 43% of daily human behavior is habitual. 43%.
It's staggering. I mean, that means almost half of your waking life is happening in the exact same location at the exact same time without you ever consciously deciding to do it.
Which basically means you aren't really deciding. You're just like executing a pre-written program.
Exactly. You're on autopilot.
So let's make this real for a second for you listening. Think about your own morning today. There is this invisible architecture to your daily life that you probably don't even see.
Oh, absolutely. The morning is prime time for this.
Right. You probably brush your teeth using the exact same motion you did yesterday. You probably started in the exact same side of your mouth.
You took the exact same driving route to work or to the grocery store.
Yeah, and you reflexively reach for your phone the second you hit a red light, right? Or the moment you get placed on hold. You walk into your kitchen and make your coffee in this precise, almost choreographed sequence.
You probably even sit in the exact same spot at the kitchen table every single day.
Yes. And you do all of this largely without noticing it because, as Wood's research points out, noticing is simply not required.
The behavior has achieved complete automaticity. It runs itself. And I think setting the stage for what we're doing in this deep dive today, it's really important to clarify what this is not.
Right. We're not just doing surface level stuff here.
No, we are not doing another chat about, productivity hacks or how to optimize your morning routine to squeeze out 5 more minutes of emails.
We are going way deeper than that.
Because if we are talking about 43% of your actions, we are fundamentally talking about the texture of your daily experience. We're talking about your physical health, your mental well-being, your relationships.
Even your long-term success.
Exactly. The trajectory of your life is rarely determined by those rare, grand, sweeping decisions you make. It's determined by the accumulation of these invisible automated habits.
So understanding how these behaviors form and why they are so incredibly stubborn and how we can deliberately architect them, that's really an exploration of how human character itself is forged.
That's a great way to put it.
I really appreciate that framing, actually, because honestly,
Yeah.
hearing that 43% number initially gave me a bit of an existential crisis.
I think it does for a lot of people. It feels like a blow to our ego.
Yeah, it feels like an attack on free will.
Yeah.
But when you really look at the science, this automation isn't a glitch in our system. It isn't a flaw in human design.
Not at all. It's actually a masterpiece of evolutionary efficiency. It's a survival mechanism, plain and simple.
Because the brain is just this massive energy hog.
Oh, huge. I mean, the human brain accounts for maybe 2% of your body weight, but it consumes about 20% of your daily caloric energy.
Wow. Mostly in the form of glucose, right?
Right. Conscious thought like analyzing new situations, making deliberate choices, suppressing impulses, all of that is metabolically very expensive.
So it's literally draining to make decisions.
Yes. If you had to consciously process every single micro step of brewing a cup of coffee, I mean, just think about that for a second.
Oh man, it would be exhausting.
You'd have to actively locate the filter, measure the grounds, calculate the water ratio, monitor your hand movements to avoid spilling, figure out the buttons on the machine.
You would be completely cognitively depleted before you even took a sip.
Exactly. So the brain's brilliant solution is to outsource.
It just delegates the work.
It aggressively hunts for routines it can push down into automatic processing. By turning that morning coffee sequence into a habit, your brain frees up all that precious conscious bandwidth, your prefrontal cortex, to do what it does best.
Which is solving genuinely novel problems.
Right. You can ponder a complex work issue or have a meaningful conversation with your spouse, all while your body goes through the motions of making coffee.
So if we didn't have this autopilot system, We just wouldn't have the cognitive surplus necessary to do anything big.
We'd never build civilizations, let alone, learn a new language or write a book.
Okay, so if the brain is successfully shifting all this work offline to save energy, where exactly is offline?
That's the big question.
Like, what is the actual underlying code of this autopilot system? And what physical part of the brain is taking the reins?
Well, to understand the code, we have to look at the foundational framework of habit structure. And the absolute best way to visualize this is through a really simple three-part loop.
Oh, this brings up Charles Duhigg's 2012 book, The Power of Habit,
Yes, exactly.
because he popularized this framework that originally came out of some fascinating research at MIT back in the 1990s.
Right, they were studying rats and mazes to see how memory and habits physically form in the brain.
And Duhigg breaks every single habit down into three components,
Hmm.
right? The cue, the routine, and the reward.
The habit loop. It sounds deceptively simple, but the neurological mechanics behind it are profound. So let's look at how those three parts actually interact.
Okay, let's break it down. First up, the cue.
Right, the cue, this is the trigger. It's the environmental signal that basically tells your brain, okay, initiate the program.
And from what the research shows, a cue can be almost anything in your environment.
It can be highly specific. It could be a certain time of day, like 3 p.m., or a location, like walking through the front door of your house.
It can even be an emotional state, right? Like boredom or anxiety or loneliness.
Absolutely. It can be a preceding behavior, like the act of turning off your alarm clock, or it could even be the presence of a specific person who always stresses you out.
So the cue is just a sensory input that acts as a switch.
Exactly. Which then triggers the second component, the routine.
And the routine is just the behavior itself.
Yeah, it's the physical action, the mental sequence, or even the emotional response that gets executed automatically once that cue is detected.
Okay, and then you have the critical third piece, the reward.
Right, because without the reward, the loop never closes. The reward is the positive outcome or the relief that follows the routine.
It's basically the brain's way of evaluating if this whole sequence was actually useful.
Exactly. If the routine results in a hit of sugar or a feeling of social connection or just relief from stress, the brain takes note. It says, okay, that worked. That solved our problem or made us feel good.
We need to remember this exact sequence for the next time we encounter that cue.
Bingo. And over time, as this cue routine reward sequence repeats, something structurally changes in the brain.
This is the part that blows my mind. The responsibility for the behavior literally moves from one physical location in your head to another.
It physically migrates. When you are first learning a new behavior, it's controlled by the prefrontal cortex.
That's the area right behind your forehead, right? The CEO of the brain.
Right. It handles conscious decision-making, logical analysis, executive function. But as the loop is repeated and validated by the reward, the brain encodes that sequence into a much older, deeper structure.
And that structure is called the basal ganglia.
The basal ganglia. It's basically a golf ball-sized lump of tissue deep near the brainstem, and it is primarily associated with procedural learning and automatic motor behaviors.
So it's a very primitive part of the brain.
Very primitive. And once the cue routine reward loop is fully encoded down there, the prefrontal cortex essentially clocks out.
It just stops participating in the behavior entirely.
It does. It is no longer a conscious choice. It is a fully automated program running on legacy hardware.
I always think of it like carving a path through a dense jungle.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right, like the first few times you walk from point A to point B, you are using a machete. You're sweating. You're looking out for snakes. You're consciously deciding where to place every single step.
That's your prefrontal cortex doing the exhausting work of learning.
Exactly. But after you walk that exact same path 100 times, 1,000 times, the brush is cleared, the dirt is packed down, it becomes a smooth, paved road.
You don't even have to look at your feet anymore.
You can just stroll down it blindfolded. The basal ganglia is that paved road.
It really is.
But wait, here's my pushback on that. If it's just a pathway, if it's just a program stored in a specific part of the brain, why can't I just decide to stop walking down it? Like when I realize I have a bad habit, say biting my nails when I'm anxious, why can't I just use my prefrontal cortex to reach into the basal ganglia and hit delete?
It's a totally logical question, but that is exactly where the computer analogy or even the jungle path analogy breaks down.
How so?
Because you cannot delete a habit from the basal ganglia. The neurological reality of how our brains wire themselves is that the neural pathway, once it's fully formed and thickened through repetition, is effectively permanent.
Hold on. Permanent. As in, for the rest of my life.
For the rest of your life, it is undeletable code. The synaptic connections that form that specific cue routine reward association don't just dissolve because you logically decide you don't want them anymore.
Even if I stop doing the habit for years.
Even then, they don't disappear. The pathway might go dormant, the paved road might get a little dusty, so to speak.
Okay.
But the moment you are exposed to the original cue, especially under stress when the prefrontal cortex is compromised, that dormant pathway can reactivate instantly.
Wow. So that completely explains why a smoker who quit, like 10 years ago, can suddenly crave a cigarette with overwhelming intensity.
Exactly. Just by walking past an old bar they used to frequent, or after a severe emotional shock, the cue is still hardwired to the routine.
So if I can't delete a bad habit, what on earth am I supposed to do? Are we just hopelessly trapped by every bad routine we accidentally encoded in our 20s?
Far from it. The solution isn't dilution, it's competition.
Competition, okay.
If you have a permanent pathway in your brain, the only way to stop using it is to build a competing pathway that is stronger, more efficient, and easier to access.
So you have to create a new routine that is triggered by the exact same cue and ideally provides the exact same reward.
Right. You are essentially building a brand new super highway right next to the old destructive road and training your brain to take the new exit.
Okay, we're definitely going to get into the exact mechanics of how to build that competing superhighway later.
Good, because that's the actionable part.
But first, knowing that these pathways are virtually permanent once they form, it makes me incredibly curious about the actual construction process.
They're rewiring.
Yeah. How does a sequence of clumsy, conscious actions compress into an automatic habit? And why do these habits exert such a gravitational pull on our behavior?
Well, to understand that pull, we need to dive into two fascinating neurological mechanisms. First is the process known as chunking, and second is the highly counterintuitive behavior of dopamine.
Let's tackle chunking first. We touched on the metabolic cost of learning earlier, how the prefrontal cortex gets exhausted.
Right. When you are exposed to a novel situation, your brain is firing on all cylinders. It is absorbing massive amounts of sensory data, processing it, and trying to figure out the appropriate response.
I always think of learning to drive a manual transmission car, or really just learning to drive a car at all. Do you remember how utterly overwhelming that was at 16?
Oh, it is the perfect example of high cognitive load.
You're sitting in the driver's seat, and every single micro-action is a distinct, terrifying task. You have to consciously instruct your body, like, okay, adjust the rear view mirror, now find the turn signal.
Don't hit the wipers by accident.
Check the left blind spot. Apply exactly 1 pound of pressure to the gas pedal while simultaneously lifting your foot off the clutch. You are drenched in sweat just trying to reverse out of a driveway.
Your prefrontal cortex is absolutely screaming at you.
But look at you now. You can back out of a driveway, navigate a complex intersection, and merge onto a highway, all while drinking a coffee and carrying on a deep conversation with a passenger in the seat next to you.
How is that possible? It's because of chunking.
Through repetition.
Right. Your basal ganglia takes that sequence of 50 distinct conscious decisions and binds them together into a single automated chunk of behavior.
So backing out of the driveway is no longer 50 steps.
It is one continuous fluid motion that requires zero conscious oversight.
And the incredible thing from the research is that neuroscientists can actually watch this chunking process happen in real time using fMRI brain scans.
They can. It's amazing to see. When a subject is first learning a sequence, their entire brain is lit up with electrical activity. The blood flow to the prefrontal cortex is massive.
Because they're focusing so hard.
But as the behavior is repeated and the chunking occurs, the brain scans change dramatically. The overall activity just plummets.
Wow.
Eventually, you only see a spike of activity at the very beginning of the behavior, when the cue is recognized, and another spike at the very end when the reward is received.
And in the middle, during the actual routine.
The brain essentially goes completely quiet.
That is wild.
The basal ganglia is handling the execution so efficiently that it registers as minimal neurological activity. The conscious brain is literally resting while the body performs the complex task.
That perfectly explains the automation side of it.
Yep.
It explains why I sometimes arrive at work and realize I have no memory of the 20-minute drive.
Highway hypnosis.
Exactly. But it doesn't fully explain the compulsion. It doesn't explain the craving. Like, why is it that when I hear a notification ping on my phone, I feel this almost physical urge to look at it?
Right. Well, to understand the craving, we have to look at dopamine. And this is where the science gets deeply counterintuitive.
How so?
Because most people have a fundamental misunderstanding of what dopamine actually does.
Yeah, I mean, the pop culture definition of dopamine is that it's the pleasure chemical. We think dopamine is the feeling of reward itself. You eat a piece of chocolate, you feel pleasure, that's the dopamine.
And early on in a learning process, that is roughly how it works. You perform a new behavior, you experience a rewarding outcome, and your brain releases a spike of dopamine.
Okay, so far so good.
That dopamine surge tells your brain, hey, this was great, remember what we just did.
Mm.
But as the habit loop solidifies, as the sequence becomes chunked and the reward becomes highly predictable, the timing of the dopamine release physically shifts.
This part just blew my mind.
It's extraordinary because the brain is a prediction machine. Once the basal ganglia learns that QA always leads to reward C, the reward is no longer a surprise.
And predictable rewards generate less dopamine.
Significantly less dopamine at the moment they are actually received.
Wait, so the pleasure actually decreases over time?
The neurological spike does, yes, but the dopamine doesn't disappear. Instead, through a process we can roughly call prediction error updating, the dopamine spike travels backward in time.
Backward in time.
It shifts from the moment of the reward to the moment of the cue.
So the trigger itself causes the chemical release, not the result.
Okay.
Let me make sure I'm mapping this correctly.
Okay, go for it.
My alarm clock goes off at 6:00 a.m. That's the cue. My brain has learned through years of chunking that this cue eventually leads to the reward of drinking a hot cup of coffee.
Right.
So the moment I hear the alarm, before I have even moved a muscle to get out of bed, my brain releases a massive spike of dopamine in anticipation of the coffee.
Precisely. And here is the crucial distinction. Dopamine is not just about pleasure. It is the primary driver of motivation and motor action.
It's the chemical of wanting.
Yes. That spike of dopamine at the cue creates an intense, visceral craving. It creates a state of neurological tension that can only be relieved by executing the routine and securing the predicted reward.
It's practically pulling you forward.
It forces you out of bed and into the kitchen. Your brain is saying, I have already released the chemical anticipating the reward. Now you must go acquire it.
So this is why habits are so hard to break.
Exactly. You aren't just fighting a memory. You are fighting a potent neurochemical drive that is triggered by your environment before your conscious mind even has a chance to intervene.
Okay, if we are dealing with physical changes to the brain structure in the basal ganglia and profound shifts in how and when neurotransmitters like dopamine are released, how long does this rewiring process actually take?
The million-dollar question.
All right, if I want to build a new superhighway to compete with an old one, how long am I swinging a machete in the jungle? Because there's a very famous number associated with this.
I know exactly where you are going with this, the 21-day myth.
It is everywhere. If you have ever read a self-help article, bought a daily planner, or watched a motivational speaker, you've heard it presented as absolute gospel. It takes 21 days to form a new habit.
It's ubiquitous.
It's so deeply ingrained in our culture that we just accept it as biological fact.
And it is a remarkable case study in how bad science propagates. Because that 21-day timeline is entirely fabricated.
Entirely fabricated.
It has virtually no basis in the neuroscience of habit formation.
I looked into where this actually came from, and the origin story is wild. It traces back to the 1960s to a plastic surgeon named Dr. Maxwell Maltz.
Right, who wrote a massively successful book called Psycho-Cybernetics.
Yeah. In his practice, Maltz noticed a pattern. When he performed a nose job, it took the patient about 21 days to get used to seeing their new face in the mirror. When he performed an amputation, the patient experienced phantom limb sensations for about 21 days before adapting.
So he made a casual anecdotal observation about patients adjusting to physical trauma and changes in their self-image.
Exactly. He wrote that it requires a minimum of about 21 days for an old mental image to dissolve and a new one to gel.
And that's all it took.
Through this massive game of cultural telephone over the next 50 years, a minimum of 21 days to adjust to surgery somehow mutated into it takes exactly 21 days to form a permanent lifestyle habit.
It's an incredibly appealing myth because 3 weeks feels so manageable. It's just long enough to sound scientific, but short enough to sell books and fitness programs.
Right. Anyone can do 3 weeks.
But when we look at actual rigorous behavioral science, the picture is much more complex and, frankly, requires a lot more patience.
Which brings us to the definitive research on this. A 2010 study conducted by Philippa Lally and her team at University College London.
This is the benchmark study.
They decided to actually test the 21-day timeline by tracking real people forming real habits in their daily lives.
Right. Lally's team recruited volunteers who wanted to build a new health-related habit, things like drinking a bottle of water with lunch or running for 15 minutes before dinner.
Real, everyday goals.
And they had the participants report daily on how automatic the behavior felt. And they defined automaticity using very specific criteria. Like, did the behavior feel like something they did without thinking?
Was it hard not to do it?
Exactly. Did it require conscious effort? They were looking for that exact moment when the basal ganglia takes over.
And when they crunched the numbers, they completely shattered the 21-day rule.
Completely. What they found was a massive spectrum. Depending on the person and the specific habit they were trying to form, the time it took to reach automaticity ranged from 18 days all the way up to 254 days.
254 days. That is more than 8 months of continuous, conscious effort to make a behavior automatic.
Yes. But when they averaged all the data out across all the participants and all the different behaviors, the median time to form a new habit was 66 days.
66 days. A full 2 months. That is a vastly different commitment than 3 weeks.
Very different.
Why is the range so wide, though? Like, why does one person build a habit in 2 weeks, while someone else takes the better part of a year?
Well, Lally's research highlighted several critical variables that dictate the speed of habit formation. The first, and perhaps most obvious, is the complexity of the behavior itself.
Right, the cognitive load we talked about.
Exactly. If your goal is to drink a glass of water after breakfast, the friction is incredibly low. The motor sequence is simple. The basal ganglia can chunk that together very quickly.
But if your goal is, say, doing 50 sit-ups after lunch,
Exactly. You are dealing with a vastly more complex sequence of actions, physical discomfort, and a much higher demand on the prefrontal cortex. Complex behaviors simply take longer to automate.
makes sense. And the second variable the research pointed out is context consistency.
This goes back to the cue. For a habit to form, the brain needs a reliable trigger to bind the routine to. If you decide you want to build a reading habit, but on Monday you read in bed at 10 p.m., on Tuesday you read on the train at 8 a.m., and on Wednesday you read in the break room at noon.
Your brain is receiving conflicting signals.
Right. The environment is constantly changing. There is no consistent cue for the dopamine to attach to.
You aren't giving the basal ganglia a stable target.
Precisely. But if you read in the exact same armchair, with the exact same lamp turned on, immediately after pouring your morning coffee, you are reinforcing a highly specific environmental cue.
The brain recognizes the pattern much faster.
Context consistency accelerates automaticity.
And the third variable is something we don't have much control over: genetics.
We do have to acknowledge biological reality here. Some people simply possess nervous systems that adapt faster. There are individual variations in how dopamine receptors function, in neuroplasticity, and in basal ganglia efficiency. Some people are biologically predisposed to form strong habits quickly, both good and bad.
Okay, looking at that 66-day average, a very practical question comes up. Because life happens, right?
It always does.
What happens if you get sick or you travel and you miss a day? There is a huge amount of anxiety around breaking the streak.
Oh, massive anxiety.
People feel like if they miss day 40, all their progress is wiped out, the neural pathway dissolves, and they are back to day 0. Doesn't breaking the streak reset the clock?
It's a pervasive anxiety, often fueled by habit-tracking apps that turn red and yell at you when you miss a day. But Lally's data is incredibly reassuring on this point.
Oh, thank goodness.
They found that occasional missed days had virtually no impact on the overall habit formation process.
So an imperfect streak doesn't ruin the pathway.
Not at all. The brain is remarkably resilient. What matters is not unbroken perfection. What matters is overall frequency over time.
Think of it like investing in an index fund.
That's a great comparison.
If you miss a monthly contribution, you haven't destroyed the entire portfolio. You just missed one compounding cycle.
Exactly. If you execute the cue routine loop 60 times over the course of 75 days, you are still driving massive neurological adaptation. The paved road is still being built, even if you took a day off from construction.
Perfection is a psychological trap.
Frequency is the biological requirement.
That is such a relief. It takes away the catastrophic thinking that causes so many people to quit entirely after one slip-up. But even with that grace period, 66 days is a substantial investment of cognitive energy.
It's a real marathon.
As a listener, if I only have the willpower and the prefrontal bandwidth to focus on one 66-day cycle at a time, I want to make sure I am getting the highest possible return on that investment. Where should I point my limited energy?
That is the right strategic question. And the answer lies in a phenomenon that researchers call keystone habits.
I love this concept. Keystone habits are these unique foundational routines that, once established, act like a domino effect.
They really do.
They spontaneously trigger a cascade of positive changes in completely unrelated areas of your life.
They are the habits that alter your underlying architecture. And the most heavily researched, undeniably powerful keystone habit is physical exercise.
We have to talk about the Exeter study here.
Oh, the longitudinal study from the University of Exeter. It tracks this perfectly.
Right. They found that when sedentary people successfully established a regular exercise routine, just committing to working out a few times a week, a bizarre chain reaction occurred.
Without any prompting from the researchers.
None. And without any deliberate intention from the participants, these people spontaneously started eating healthier foods. They started drinking less alcohol.
They naturally adhered to better sleep schedules.
And incredibly, they even showed measurable decreases in procrastination at work.
They didn't sign up for a diet or a sleep clinic or a time management seminar. They just ran on a treadmill. Yet their entire behavioral ecosystem improved.
So why does that happen? How does lifting weights or going for a swim magically make you better at answering emails or avoiding junk food?
Well, it operates on two distinct levels, the neurochemical and the psychological. Neurologically, exercise is profoundly transformative. It increases blood flow to the brain and triggers the release of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is essentially fertilizer for neural pathways.
Wow.
More importantly, regular cardiovascular exercise has been shown to physically increase the volume of the prefrontal cortex and optimize dopamine receptor density.
You are literally upgrading the hardware of your brain.
Yes, you are increasing your brain's biological capacity for impulse control and self-regulation. So when that 3 p.m. donut craving hits, your prefrontal cortex is simply stronger and more capable of overriding the basal ganglia's impulse.
That's the neurological side. And what about the psychological level?
It comes down to a concept called generalized self-efficacy. When you prove to yourself that you can do something difficult, like dragging yourself to the gym when you're tired, and doing it consistently, you fundamentally alter your own self-perception.
You start to trust yourself more.
You build a deep internal evidence base that you are capable of disciplined change. That confidence doesn't stay confined to the gym. It spills over.
You sit down at your desk to tackle a difficult project, and your brain subconsciously thinks, well, I crushed that spin class this morning. I'm clearly a person who can handle discomfort. I can handle this spreadsheet too.
Exactly. And that brings us to the absolute core of behavior change, because we've talked about the brain anatomy and the timeline and the strategy of keystone habits.
Right.
But the Exeter study reveals that the deepest layer of habit formation isn't just about what you do, it's about who you believe you are.
And this transition from behavior to identity is where the work of James Clear, particularly in his book Atomic Habits, has been so revolutionary.
His framework is brilliant. Clear proposes a framework of concentric circles for behavior change. Most people, he argues, start at the outermost circle, outcomes.
They set a goal based on a result. I want to lose 20 pounds. Or I want to write a novel.
Outcomes are about what you want to achieve. The next circle inward is processes. This is where most traditional habit advice lives. I will go to the gym 4 days a week, or I will write 500 words every morning.
Processes are about what you do.
Exactly. Both of those layers are necessary, but Clear argues they aren't the foundation of lasting change. The innermost circle, the deepest driver of human behavior, is identity.
It is what you believe about yourself.
The shift is subtle, but incredibly profound. Instead of saying, I am trying to lose weight, the identity-driven approach is to say, I am an athlete.
Instead of saying, I want to write a book, you say, I am a writer.
The psychology behind this is so robust. Humans have a deep, innate drive to act in alignment with their self-concept. Cognitive dissonance, the feeling of acting in contradiction to who you believe you are, is incredibly uncomfortable.
So if your identity is, I'm a person who prioritizes my health, missing a workout isn't just a failure to execute a process. It's a violation of your self-image.
The motivation to maintain your identity is infinitely stronger and more resilient than the motivation to hit an arbitrary metric on a scale.
And Clear makes the brilliant observation that identity and habits function as a feedback loop. Your habits shape your identity, and your identity shapes your habits.
Every time you perform a behavior, you are essentially casting a vote for the kind of person you are.
I think about it like compounding interest. One workout doesn't make you fit, just like $1 doesn't make you rich. But every single time you put on your running shoes, you are casting a vote for the identity of runner.
You are depositing a small piece of evidence into your psychological bank account.
Over hundreds of repetitions, the votes accumulate, the interest compounds, and eventually, the identity becomes undeniably real.
That's beautifully put.
But wait, I have to pause here because my brain constantly fights this concept.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
If I decide today, having not exercised in 3 years, that I am an athlete, my brain immediately calls my bluff. It says, no, you're not. You're sitting on the couch eating potato chips. You're lying.
It feels like delusional imposter syndrome.
Yes. How do you authentically adopt an identity before you have the evidence to back it up?
It is the most common and natural resistance to this idea. The trick is to rethink what an identity claim actually is. You are treating the statement, I am an athlete, as a resume, a factual summary of your past achievement.
And if you look in your past, the resume is blank, so it feels as a lie.
Right. But an identity claim in the context of habit formation is not a resume. It is a compass.
A compass.
Yes, it is a directional bearing for your future choices. When you say, I'm a healthy person, you aren't claiming you have a perfect medical history. You are adopting a lens through which to evaluate your next decision.
So when you face a choice between taking the stairs or taking the elevator, you consult the compass.
Exactly. What would a healthy person do? The identity claim guides the behavior, which casts the vote, which eventually builds the resume.
The claim must precede the evidence, or the evidence will never be generated.
The compass, not the resume.
That completely reframes the imposter syndrome for me. Okay, so we have the compass. We know we need 66 days of frequency to build a keystone habit. But we're still left with the elephant in the room. The basal ganglia is full of permanent, undeletable bad code.
The old off-ramps.
We are fighting a two-front war. We are trying to build new highways, but the old, destructive off-ramps are still there, tempting us every single day. How do we practically dismantle or at least bypass these ingrained bad habits?
This requires a tactical approach, returning to Duhigg's framework. Since we know we cannot delete the neural pathway, we have to use the golden rule of habit change.
Which is,
Keep the cue, keep the reward, but swap the routine.
let's walk through a hyper-specific example. The classic 3 p.m. stress snack at the office. This is a deeply entrenched habit loop for millions of people.
It's a perfect case study. Let's map the loop. The cue is a combination of time 3 p.m. biology, a natural dip in circadian energy, and emotion-accumulated workday stress.
And the automatic routine is getting up from the desk, walking to the break room, and eating a sugary pastry.
And the reward is what the brain is actually seeking. It's not necessarily the pastry itself. The reward is a brief surge of glucose, a momentary distraction from the stressful spreadsheet, and the physical act of moving around.
So I want to break this habit. The absolute worst strategy is to just sit at my desk at 3 p.m. and white-knuckle it, just staring at screen, relying on sheer willpower to ignore the craving.
Relying on willpower against a basal ganglia craving is a guaranteed failure over a long enough timeline. Willpower, or conscious self-control, is a depletable resource.
By 3 p.m., your prefrontal cortex is already exhausted.
You cannot win a tug-of-war against a dopamine spike.
You have to honor the loop.
You must respect the neurological architecture. The cue is going to happen. The brain's demand for the reward, stress relief, and distraction is non-negotiable. The only variable you can manipulate is the routine.
You have to insert a new behavior that satisfies the original craving.
So at 3 p.m., when the stress hits, instead of walking to the break room for a pastry, I walk outside for a 5-minute loop around the building. Or I go make a cup of herbal tea. Or I sit in my chair and do 2 minutes of box breathing.
The cue remains identical. The reward, distraction, physical movement, stress relief is achieved.
But the routine has been swapped from something destructive to something neutral or positive.
Over time, the brain learns that the new routine satisfies the craving just as well, and it begins to pave that new pathway.
Exactly.
But what if swapping the routine feels impossible because the cue is just too aggressive? What if my coworker keeps a glass jar of M&Ms on their desk, right in my line of sight? The dopamine anticipation is triggering every time I look up.
This brings us to the ultimate hack for habit change. It is far more powerful than willpower, and far easier than trying to aggressively rewire the loop. It's called environment design.
This is the realization that human beings are fundamentally reactive creatures. Our behavior is shaped by the spaces we inhabit.
Decades of psychological research reveal a fascinating truth about people with supposedly ironclad discipline. When you study them, you find they aren't actually using willpower more often than anyone else.
In fact, they use it less.
They have simply designed their environments so they are rarely exposed to cues that trigger destructive habits.
They engineer the friction.
Exactly. If you want to stop eating junk food, do not rely on your ability to resist the cookies in your pantry at 9 p.m. Your prefrontal cortex will lose that battle. The solution is to remove the cue entirely.
Do not buy the cookies.
If the visual cue is not present in the environment, the basal ganglia program is never triggered. The craving never starts.
It's about recognizing that friction is a tool.
Yeah.
You increase the friction for bad habits and decrease the friction for good habits.
Right.
If I want to build a habit of reading before bed instead of doom scrolling on social media, I shouldn't just rely on motivation at 11 p.m. I need to design the environment in the morning.
Set it up early.
I make the bed, I take the book, and I place it directly on the center of my pillow. Then I take my phone charger and plug it in the kitchen, not the bedroom.
You have perfectly manipulated the cues. When you walk into the bedroom at night, the cue for the desired behavior is aggressively present and unavoidable. The cue for the undesired behavior is hidden, and the friction to retrieve it is high.
You are outsourcing your discipline to your environment.
Now, when it comes to actively installing those new positive habits, there is a specific formula that leverages the permanence of the basal ganglia to our advantage. It's called habit stacking.
Habit stacking is a brilliantly efficient strategy. The concept is based on the fact that you already have dozens, if not hundreds, of deeply ingrained habits that you execute flawlessly every single day without thinking.
Brushing your teeth, turning on the shower, brewing coffee, locking the front door.
These are paved, multi-lane highways in the brain.
Exactly. So instead of trying to build a new habit from scratch and hoping you remember a new cue, you piggyback on the automaticity of an existing habit. You treat the completion of the old habit as the cue for the new habit.
The formula is incredibly simple. After I current habit, I will new habit.
It creates a powerful chain reaction.
Think about it like drafting behind a semi-truck on the highway. The truck is doing all the hard work of pushing the air out of the way, and you just tuck in behind it and get pulled along in the slipstream.
So after I pour my morning coffee, I will write in my journal for 5 minutes.
The physical act of pouring the coffee, which I'm guaranteed to do, becomes the trigger for the journaling.
After I sit down at my desk, I will immediately write down my 3 top priorities for the day. Or, after I turn off the kitchen lights at night, I will fill up a glass of water and set it on my nightstand.
The reason this is so effective connects back to a previous deep dive we did on the science of procrastination. We talked about implementation intentions.
Write the when and where.
When you just have a vague goal, like I want to read more, your brain doesn't know when or where to execute it. But when you create a highly specific temporal and spatial link, after I get into bed, I will read 1 chapter, you dramatically increase the probability of follow-through.
The new habit inherits the reliability of the old one, but there is a crucial caveat to habit stacking. The stack will collapse if the new habit is too large. If you say, after I pour my coffee, I will write a 10-page essay, your prefrontal cortex will look at that cognitive load, panic, and you'll end up scrolling on your phone instead.
The friction is too high, which is why habit stacking must be paired with the physics of behavior change. B.J. Fogg's 2-minute rule.
Fogg, a behavior scientist at Stanford, talks extensively about the concept of activation energy. The hardest part of any new habit is simply starting. Once you are in motion, continuing is relatively easy.
So the 2-minute rule, which James Clear also heavily emphasizes, states that when starting a new habit, it must be scaled down into a version that takes less than 2 minutes to complete.
You strip away all the ambition. You don't commit to doing a 45-minute yoga routine. You commit to rolling out my yoga mat.
You don't commit to reading 30 pages. You commit to reading 1 single page.
You don't commit to running 3 miles. You commit to putting on my running shoes and tying the laces.
I always struggled with this because my logical brain would say, what is the point? Putting on my shoes doesn't burn any calories. Reading 1 page doesn't make me a scholar. This is a waste of time.
That is the prefrontal cortex talking, focusing entirely on the outcome. But we are not trying to achieve an outcome in the beginning. We are trying to engineer the basal ganglia.
The point is not the workout. The point is mastering the art of showing up.
You are lowering the activation energy to practically zero.
Yes.
You are establishing the cue routine reward loop with the absolute minimal investment of willpower. You are building the on-ramp to the highway.
If you can train your brain to automatically put on the running shoes every single time you finish your morning coffee, you have won the hardest battle.
Once that neural pathway is established, Scaling up the behavior, running around the block, then running a mile, then running 3 is a secondary, much easier process.
But you cannot optimize a habit that does not exist. You have to standardize before you can optimize.
Exactly.
I want to take all of this, the basal ganglia, the dopamine anticipation, the 66-day timeline, habit stacking, and the 2-minute rule, and apply it to a real-world scenario.
Let's do it.
Let's look at one of the most challenging, prolonged, cognitive tasks a person can undertake, learning a new language. Let's use the example of someone trying to achieve fluency in English.
Language acquisition is the ultimate crucible for everything we've discussed. It is the perfect case study. Because culturally, we have a massive misconception about language learning.
Right.
We think fluency is a test of innate intelligence or a special talent for grammar or a perfectly optimized memory.
But looking at it through the lens of neuroscience, it's none of those things. It's fundamentally a massive, prolonged habit formation project.
Precisely. The learner who eventually achieves conversational fluency isn't necessarily the person with the highest IQ. They are simply the person who's successfully built and sustained the daily cue routine reward loops necessary to absorb the language.
Let's map out a typical but flawed approach to language learning. A lot of people rely on bursts of motivation. They feel guilty they aren't practicing, so on Sunday afternoon, they lock themselves in a room and binge study English vocabulary and grammar for 3 straight hours.
And from a neurological standpoint, that is incredibly inefficient.
Why? What's happening in the brain?
Because of the principle of long-term potentiation, the physical strengthening of synapses, the brain needs repeated, consistent signals to trigger the chunking process in the basal ganglia. A 3-hour binge once a week is metabolically exhausting for the prefrontal cortex, but it does not provide the sheer frequency of repetition required to encode a habit.
The brain essentially views it as an isolated stress event, not a pattern worth automating.
Exactly.
So what is the alternative?
Consistency over intensity. Spending 20 minutes every single day engaging with English is vastly superior to 3 hours once a week.
Daily exposure provides the repetitive cues necessary for the dopamine system to begin anticipating the practice, and for the neural pathways to thicken.
And we can engineer this using the tools we just discussed. Instead of waiting for motivation, you use habit stacking. After I start my car for my morning commute, the established cue, I will immediately press play on an English podcast, the new routine.
And you utilize the 2-minute rule. On days when you are exhausted and don't want to study, you don't skip it. You just scale it down. I will listen to just 2 minutes of this podcast. You maintain the frequency. You protect the pathway.
We also have to apply the concept of keystone habits here. If you are overwhelmed by all the different aspects of learning English grammar rules, flashcards, speaking practice, writing, what is the one domino that makes everything else easier?
The linguistic research strongly points to daily listening immersion. Making it an unbreakable habit to simply listen to English content every single day, whether you understand all of it or not, is the foundational keystone.
Just getting the sounds in your ears.
Yes. It creates a baseline automaticity. Your brain begins to subconsciously recognize the cadence, the rhythm, and the phonemes of the language.
Once that acoustic foundation is laid, all the subsequent active practice memorizing vocabulary, practicing pronunciation, has a pre-existing framework to attach to.
And finally, circling back to James Clear, we have the ultimate driver, identity. If a listener is struggling to learn English, they need to examine the story they are telling themselves. There's a massive psychological chasm between saying, I have to study English tonight because it's required for my job promotion, versus saying, I am a language learner. I am a global communicator.
The first statement frames the activity as an external obligation, a chore imposed from the outside. The brain naturally seeks to minimize chores.
But the second statement is an identity compass. It's a vote for who you are. When you view yourself as a language learner, practicing isn't a chore, it's an affirmation of your identity.
When you combine the identity compass with daily frequencies stacked onto existing cues and scaled down on hard days, the basal ganglia eventually takes over. The English language ceases to be a subject you are studying and becomes an automated part of how you process the world.
As we wrap up this incredibly deep dive, I want to bring it all the way back to you, the listener. We started with a staggering, almost frightening statistic. 43% of your day is automated.
Right.
43% of your life is happening on autopilot.
But the crucial shift is that you are no longer a passive passenger on that autopilot. You now possess the underlying code. You understand the profound permanence of the basal ganglia.
You know how to manipulate the cue routine reward loop. You know how to design your environment to eliminate friction for good choices and maximize friction for bad ones.
You understand the physics of the 2-minute rule and the compounding power of casting identity votes.
You have the toolkit to become the active architect of your own automation. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to chew on.
We have spent the last hour breaking down the incredibly precise mechanics of the habit loop. We've talked about how environmental cues trigger anticipatory dopamine spikes that drive compulsive behavior.
Powerful science.
It is. And if you understand the science, you have to realize that the largest technology companies, app developers, social media platforms, and marketers in the world understand this exact science too. In fact, they employ thousands of behavioral psychologists to optimize it.
The notifications, the infinite scroll, the autoplay features, none of it is accidental. It is precision-engineered environment design aimed directly at your basal ganglia.
They are actively attempting to install their routines onto your mental hard drive. So as you move through your day tomorrow, observing that invisible architecture of your life, I want you to ask yourself a question.
Whose habit loops are you currently running?
When you reflexively reach for your phone in the elevator or open an app without thinking, are you executing a program that you deliberately chose to install, or did someone else write the code?
It's your brain. It's your autopilot. Make sure you are the one programming the destination.